this is one of the things that's kind of more Russian-esque about what's happening now, which is that in some ways, yes, they're blaming the US, but I think part of what they're trying to get at more generally is to make the point that the origin may not be China. It could be the US, it could be Italy, we don't really know. And then the second is to really just generally muddy the waters about the fact of whether there is an actual truth here.
How is the Chinese Communist Party spreading conspiracy theories and propaganda about the CCP virus or coronavirus pandemic? How is it using internet bots and Russian-style disinformation to manipulate public opinion globally? Why is it important to distrust official data and talking points coming out of China in general, but especially about COVID-19? And what can the average person do to counter this threat? In this episode, we sit down with Sarah Cook, a senior research analyst for Freedom House focusing on China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. She also directs Freedom House's China Media Bulletin, a monthly digest with news and analysis on media freedom in China. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jan Jekielek. Sarah Cook, so great to have you back on American Thought Leaders.
My pleasure. It's nice to be back.
So Sarah, Chinese Communist Party disinformation, this is your specialty, especially in the media sphere. You just had an amazing China Media Bulletin, which I read every month, about this. Tell me what you're seeing.
So it's really interesting because some of the things that we're seeing are not things we saw before. But I think a big part of what we are seeing are various examples of Chinese official state media, Chinese official accounts by like foreign ministry spokespeople or by diplomats, and various like Twitter bot networks, essentially propagating various clearly proven falsehoods, like real hardcore disinformation with regard to the coronavirus and the situation right now. So, it started, there were a few early examples and it's definitely amplified. I mean, one example that a lot of people caught early on was when the virus and the outbreak was mostly within China, and the Chinese government and officials were building these kind of makeshift hospitals or quarantine centers in Wuhan. And, they were advertising that in all the propaganda, and everybody was like, wow, China's building this in like 6 days. And then actually some of the Chinese state media were caught as having, when they were posting on Twitter about this, as having used catalog photos, saying basically, this is what we're building. But since then, it's really evolved to be, I would say, even more troublesome falsehoods and manipulations. I mean, the biggest one, obviously, is this effort to say that the virus did not actually originate in China. There's a few versions of that. There's just general statements by Chinese epidemiologists and others saying, well, we don't know that it started in China. We can't really know that that's where it started. There's others that are other conspiracy theories that have been amplified by official sources saying, oh, it was actually started in the US, and even the US military brought it to China. Again, provenly false. And then now in Italy, actually, there was also a Chinese state media saying, well, maybe it started in Italy. And so you have things like that started off as conspiracy theories and have really been picked up and amplified by Chinese official accounts. And then you've got a situation, there was just a great report that some Italian journalists had done based on analysis of Twitter conversations and hashtags in Italy, where now we're moving on to another stage of the narrative of China trying to send like medical supplies to different countries. And apparently this hashtag, Grazie Cina, I guess, thank you China, was trending in Italy. They found that 37% of the retweets were by bots. So it was actually a manipulated echo chamber. And then on top of that, there was this video that supposedly showed Italians saying, thank you China, and again, was actually a false doctored video. But a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson tweeted out that video and said, oh, we should all work for common humanity and things like that. So you definitely see, deliberate and active efforts by both these kinds of hidden bot networks and inauthentic accounts on networks like Twitter, as well as official Chinese state media and Chinese diplomats and official spokespeople, basically spreading provenly false information about various aspects of what's happening with regard to the COVID-19 outbreak.
So, Sarah, is this more for the benefit of the Chinese population that the Chinese Communist Party has captive to their own propaganda media? Or is this more for the benefit of the international community, which it seems to be because a lot of this is in English and so forth? We've seen a number of different narratives come out of there. Can you kind of help explain how all that's working?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's been real, I would say that first of all, the answer to your question is both. I think some of what we're seeing is for domestic audiences, and some of it is for international audiences, and maybe even different parts of the international community. But I think what you look at, it is really fascinating and a bit disturbing, really, to see how these narratives have evolved. So if you look internally at China, this is one of the things we analyzed in the latest issue of the China Media Bulletin. If you look at the period of January, the first 3 weeks of January, when you already started having pretty high-level meetings, including involving Xi Jinping, about the coronavirus about some kind of new coronavirus, SARS-like disease emerging in Wuhan, the People's Daily, the Chinese Communist Party's mouthpiece, front page, nothing about it. It was all already pre-planned content and series about Xi Jinping visiting all kinds of people in different parts of China and about the run-up to the Chinese New Year and things like that. So basically, and they really help set the tone for officials too, maybe not for all of the media coverage in China, but for officials to know what they're supposed to prioritize during this time. And then you started to see, an evolution and a few mentions. And as Wuhan went under lockdown and the virus really clearly started spreading to other parts of China, another narrative emerged, which was this kind of very formulaic Communist Party hero kind of narrative about medical professionals and individual sacrifices they were making on the front lines. And there was even an effort to frame the death of the doctor who had contracted coronavirus after he had been reprimanded for trying to warn people on Chinese social media that some kind of new disease had emerged, to kind of frame him as this type of martyr without acknowledging the fact that he was punished as a whistleblower. But then one of the things that the Communist Party and the propaganda apparatus encountered was real backlash from the Chinese people, that they just weren't buying it, and that, in fact, some of the things that were being shown, especially about female medical professionals on the front line, were very humiliating and terrible. There was one big CCTV program, which is the China Central Television, the main nationwide broadcaster, that showed a 9-month pregnant woman, a nurse, I think, or a doctor, working on the front lines in Wuhan. That created enormous outrage of like, what are you talking about showing her being heroic? Send this woman home. Don't make her work when she's 9 months pregnant in this type of dangerous environment. And I think it was during that time then. So that was kind of what we saw during February. Towards the end of February, that's when these type of conspiracy theories from non-official accounts just on social media about the coronavirus supposedly originating in the United States and being brought to China somehow started circulating. And maybe some officials started to pick up on the fact that this was actually gaining traction with the parts of the Chinese public that the other narratives hadn't been gaining in terms of deflecting the blame from the CCP and from the early cover-up. And so then you did have this Chinese, top Chinese epidemiologist say in a major press conference, well, we don't know that it started in China. And then slowly but surely you see more and more of this narrative being picked up and being grabbed onto more and more aggressively by Chinese diplomats on Twitter in different places, by like pro-Kremlin like Twitter accounts that then are retweeted by the Chinese ambassadors. And even within China, you see that amidst all of the censorship about coronavirus and about criticism of the Chinese government's response, suddenly all of these like weird conspiracy theories that the US military brought it here, that it started in the US related to vaping and things like that, those miraculously aren't being censored. So you have a combination of, I would say, deliberate pushing of this narrative, and then this more implicit condoning and allowing it to circulate. And apparently it's really gained traction in China. And so I think at a time when this is such a legitimacy crisis for the Communist Party, they really latched onto that. I think for international audiences, it's a way of trying to push back and muddy the waters at a time when it's very clear that hundreds of thousands of people around the world are sick and die and going to die likely in terms of the projections, basically because of the Communist Party's authoritarian political system. And they want to deflect that as much as possible.
I mean, I've said this in another interview that I had recently, but it's kind of the height of chutzpah or something to take this situation. You know, you're very culpable. It's very sort of clear to the international community you are. I think we're even seeing, you know, the UK Prime Minister speaking up in a way that's been very uncharacteristic lately, saying, you know, I think he was saying that it could be 40 times greater the actual toll on China than they have officially reported. I guess they have some intel on that. It's kind of astounding that they would use that and try to flip it entirely the other way and say it's someone else's fault.
Right, but what else are they gonna do? I mean, the Communist Party, they're not very good at admitting their mistakes. There's a reason why they ramp up censorship every year around June 4th, because they don't want to admit that the Chinese military went in and slaughtered, you know, so many thousands of Beijing or students or protesters or people around Tiananmen Square. They're not going to go and admit that it was a mistake to crack down on Falun Gong. They're not going to admit that, you know, they maybe shouldn't have detained millions of Uyghurs, and they have to say that these are quote vocational, you know, vocational education centers and things like that. So the Communist Party, they're not really willing to admit their mistake because, of course, that has so many domestic implications, and it increases their own insecurity and all of the problems that are emerging in terms of the Chinese economy, in addition to whatever the actual death toll and number of cases in China is. And so I think that's one of the reasons. I think the CCP, they see it as this type of real existential crisis domestically. And so they need to galvanize all the troops and use whatever tools they can find in their toolbox that might actually be working to push back. And I think one of the things that happens in terms of the international dimension is they really like to use that to bring it back domestically. So they'll propagate the narrative, and they'll try to get, and they'll maybe try to get quotes from this, you know, medical expert from this country, or the UN saying this, you know, the World Health Organization saying that, oh, China did a really good job in its response. And then that's what you see all over Chinese media domestically in China. So I think that's one of the reasons why the international stuff is also very tied to the domestic element. But I think also there is an international element here. I mean, I think maybe, you know, Americans might not believe that it actually could have maybe originated in the US, and there are a lot of people in other parts of Europe who might not believe. But, you know, you look at other parts of the world, places where maybe there's already a little bit more anti-American sentiment, or suspicion or belief in other types of conspiracy theories related to to 9/11, or related to what the CIA does, or that groups like Freedom House are supposedly funded by the CIA and things like that, that then you throw this into the mix on social media. And if you look at the wording, some of it is explicit, but some of it's a little bit more vague. And they also try to use this language that's like, we should look at the evidence, and then, you know, they post to this, like, you know, conspiracy theory, right? And they try to frame and be like, well, this isn't the time for blame, and this is the time that we should be looking at global cooperation. And maybe that's true, but it's really all used to really deflect the blame, and to try to change the conversation, particularly, I think, and when you're looking at social media in parts of the world that might be more receptive to that type of narrative, and more, and then therefore welcome continued close relations with China and with the CCP.
You know, one of the things we talked about when we were speaking earlier and planning for this is how the CCP actually tested a series of different narratives internally first, right, to see what resonated. And there were a whole bunch that didn't. Can you kind of dig into that? I thought that was very fascinating.
Yeah, so that's what I was, so initially they just completely ignored it, right? And then there was this narrative which you still see happening, which is like, well, we beat this even before the decline in cases that they're saying it happened. And then this element of this kind of heroic sacrifice by individual doctors. But then when they kept facing backlash with regards to that. And then even when Xi Jinping there was a day when Xi Jinping himself went to Wuhan, and on that very day, a Chinese magazine ran this big front cover article that was an interview with one of the doctors in Wuhan who had actually been reprimanded. And it went viral on social media. And then, of course, the censors are trying to tamp it down. And then the Chinese netizens are trying to find all kinds of ways to actually still share this article. But that was like, it was a big blow, I think, in terms of the fact that was like a day of Xi's victory lap in Wuhan. So I think it was in the face of that type of skepticism of the official narrative and outpouring of rage and grief and anger and calls for free speech after Li Wenliang, the other younger doctor, had passed away in early February, that they were kind of looking for something that might stick a little better. And they stumbled on this. And, you're still seeing, inside China, this, certainly these narratives that are, positive, both we beat it, and then like all these different, individual heroes and things like that. But definitely, like on CCTV, you also saw a Chinese doctor talking about how, this came from the United States and things like that. And I think that's one of the reasons why it does make it more difficult to also trust the numbers that are coming out of China now, because the regime is so deeply invested in declaring a success that, already I think it was in like late February, a book was already being published about how Xi Jinping had led the battle successfully against COVID-19. And that was when there were still many, many more cases happening in China. So I think that, it's a combination of them having their narratives and then trying to make reality match the narrative that they've constructed, I think both domestically and internationally.
It's incredible when you put it like this to just contemplate how far from reality these narratives are. And I mean, whether it's the numbers today, we have, a new report from Bloomberg that the, U.S. intel community is actually seeing that they have a classified report that the numbers are dramatically understated. Of course, we've known this through all sorts of anecdotal evidence. We just have no idea what the real numbers are. But it strains credulity. Most people will be thinking, Sarah, this is so crazy. How can they just lie like this in plain daylight? Can you speak to this a bit?
Well, I mean, I think when you follow Chinese Communist Party propaganda, it's pretty clear that they lie an awful lot. I think, the things that they say, whether it's about Uyghurs or Tibetans or Falun Gong or about June 4th or about a whole other range of different people and individuals and events that are just so far from any kind of reality and rigorous and objective evidence. That's just what they do. And we saw that with the Hong Kong protesters too. That was the first time you really saw this type of, real hardcore disinformation, like real proven falsehoods that were trying to say that Hong Kong protesters were supposedly using US-made grenade launchers, that the US was behind the protests, and things like that. That was one of the first times we really saw like Chinese state media and Twitter network, like unauthentic networks on Twitter, being mobilized to spread this kind of disinformation. And I think what we're seeing happening in the coronavirus is that in a lot of ways, this is even more dangerous domestic political vulnerability for the Communist Party. And so they're just going more strongly at it. But I mean, I think I think even again, when it comes to like falsifying data, there's just so many examples of like any, whether it's GDP data, whether it's organ transplants, it's just so much of it is manipulated either intentionally or and I would say in a more central and coordinated manner, or it's just the basic outcome of the internal incentives. And so I think some of the things you're seeing now is that, if officials are told you should not have any cases, and maybe your promotions and other types of evaluation and your actual, career or livelihood and is dependent on whether or not you're going to, there are cases in your area, then you're going to find all kinds of ways to not have cases, either by manipulating data, either by testing less, all kinds of different, situations. And so I think sometimes and that's basically a lot. Part of what happened in the early cover up, it did relate to these internal Communist Party incentives, in the sense of that the local officials in Wuhan were more concerned about political banquets and political meetings that they were supposed to hold during that month than saying, hey, we're going to, put a stop to this, and we're not allowed to have a public health crisis emerge during that time. And that actually, we haven't seen leaked censorship directives that have, come out with regards to this. But that's something we've seen time and time again surrounding the National People's Congress meetings every year, surrounding the Olympics. For those who may remember that there was a big scandal related to baby formulas that were tainted in China, and that was covered up for a period of time because of a big national events. And so I think it's you have to understand that that's the environment that the officials are trying to navigate here when they're making these decisions of whether they declare that there's a public health crisis emerging, or that they actually have however many number of cases. I think the problem this poses internationally, and is, I think, perhaps contributed to some of the slower responses in other countries, is that some people were like, well, China's got 1.4 billion people and they've only had however many thousand cases. Maybe this coronavirus isn't so bad. And I think, it's very clear that that's not the case. And it's very clear that also there was a delay in admitting that there was human-to-human transmission. So I think there are all kinds of ways in which these different elements of the cover-ups and the manipulation of information directly affect the international toll that this virus is taking on people.
Well, what I'm hearing as you're speaking, Sarah, frankly, is that letting the system do the crazy things it does unchecked in the international community, and even supported in a lot of cases, has probably cost a really large number of lives. Again, based on already a great number, and based on the projections, a very scary number. And I just, it's painful to think about, given how, transparently out there the reality of how they operate has been.
Yeah, I think it's just one of these examples where maybe people who don't follow these things as closely, or there's just an underappreciation of how interconnected the world is, and that the Chinese Communist Party's censorship and repression, it's not only Chinese people's problem. I think people like me and people like Freedom House have been saying this for a long time. And I think there's lots of aspects of this, not only public health, but I think this really brings it out so clearly that these political pathologies in China, because of the way the Communist Party governs the country, have very real world and real life consequences for people around the world.
So Sarah, one of the things that's really disturbed me, and I've actually been actively calling this out quite a bit on Twitter and in other places, and just, letters to emails to people and so forth, is just the Chinese numbers are often, even on the Johns Hopkins kind of official page, or, with Fox News, CNN, across the board, they're being portrayed as legitimate. And I find that deeply disturbing. Again, there's the preponderance of evidence that we have no business accepting these numbers at face value for all sorts of reasons. Someone actually just posted a tweet yesterday, I think, showing that tiny Hong Kong, what portion of China's population now has the lion's share of active cases or something in China, or if not the lion's share, a giant disproportion of what you might expect. Tons and tons of evidence. What do you make of this?
I think it actually shows how well the Chinese government and state media are playing the game. They're very good at dictating a narrative in this way. And I think they realize that this is something people want information about, and they're going to give you some kind of information. And I think, to be fair to the other side, people want some kind of information about what happened in China. I think, and so they'll take at face value. They should probably put a huge asterisk on it at least. But, they don't want to just leave China blank, right? But maybe that's what they should do, if you're talking about case comparisons and reported cases. But there should be some, perhaps, clear designation for those looking at it that this is, these numbers are very problematic, and likely and inaccurate. That there's, even if we don't know what the real number is. So if you look at what the information we were actually able to get out of what was happening in Wuhan in terms of the crematoria being overworked, we actually aren't seeing reports like that from other parts of China, at least not at the moment. So it does seem that there has been some level of containment, whether it's, and so I think from that perspective, the Chinese government's maybe trying a little too hard. I think the numbers would actually be more believable if you had a couple of dozen or a few hundred cases from different parts of China than if you, it's like 0 cases outside of Hubei province. That just seems like completely unrealistic. So I think they're doing a disservice with the way they're manipulating, but there are also precedents to that. I mean, some of the research about organ transplants shows that the organ transplant numbers went up by like a perfect square. So you have like too neat data manipulation. I think for media who are dealing with it, and people who are wanting to report, well, how did, this narrative that now the U.S. has more cases than China, the U.S. has the most number of cases in the world. I mean, that may be true, but we just really don't know. And I think really being careful about those narratives, they're catchy headlines. And I think people who are concerned about the U.S. government's response and critical of the U.S. government's response, that kind of is a nice narrative that's helpful, to kind of bang the drum. But I think it is really problematic, and trying to find ways to make some of those same points without granting at face value that there are so few cases in China in a way that it just doesn't seem like it's realistic that that's the case.
So Sarah, speaking of these, the Western media and how they're reporting, we've actually have seen some of these paid inserts. This is something you and I have talked about before, just at the kind of audacity of it all. But there still to this day, with all these disinformation campaigns, with all the attacking of the U.S., blaming of the U.S., there are still paid inserts being put in these media. And what do you make of that?
So yeah, we've seen that. I mean, I think the latest issue of The Economist it wasn't a Chinese state media, it was like one of the main Chinese state media. It was this Beijing Review, which is clearly, some kind of pro-Chinese government publication. And it ran side by side, in the print edition, an article basically saying how great the Chinese response was. We've seen pieces in like the China Watch supplement online of the Wall Street Journal, which has overall been critical of the publication, has been critical of what's happened in China, has had journalists kicked out of China recently. Basically articles talking about how, trying to minimize the potential economic impact. And again, talking about how well the Chinese response was, and the Chinese government's response to this outbreak has been. And I haven't yet seen, so I think, that those are kind of framing issues. It's kind of similar to the types of this more positive spin that we see. But I think, again, I think it's especially problematic when you're talking about a public health crisis. I haven't yet been able to do a full review to see if, for example, any of these inserts have shared, say, this line that we don't know the origins. We don't know if it started in China. I think it's still been a little bit more on this trying to put a sunny picture on the situation inside of China. But even then, I think it really might be a moment for some of these outlets to, again, reconsider this arrangement and see whether they're comfortable at a time when people in their own countries are facing the consequences of this outbreak that was so badly mishandled in China, to basically be saying, no, actually China did a great job and we should all follow what China was doing. And I think, I've long, and Freedom House, we've long been critical of these. And I think a lot of human rights groups, and others have said, is there really not any other place you could get advertising from, even if it's a difficult market? And so I think this just might add more additional pressure to discontinue. And I would hope some soul searching, by some of the people in these outlets to say, is there some way we can discontinue this contract, or and not continue, or put some kind of limit on what content, have some kind of oversight on what content is being inserted into the pages of our publication.
What strikes me is that a number of these propaganda outfits from China have been, all the people there they've been listed as effectively Chinese missions, and the people working there as agents of the Chinese regime by the U.S. government, which of course they always have been and continue to be. That's not new, but the labeling is new and finally accurate, that these people aren't actually journalists, right? So perhaps this will provide this kind of tool that you're describing. That's just what strikes me anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of labeling is something that comes up also if you're thinking about how do you deal with some of this social media stuff. So, if you're talking about, Twitter bots, that in a lot of ways, these inauthentic accounts, one of the reasons we know as much about what they've done, whether it's now or, with regards to the Hong Kong protests, is because Twitter took them down, discovered this inauthentic network and took it down, and and then the data was analyzed. But I think one of the things that we've seen that's been different in the last month are actual accounts of Chinese state media and of Chinese diplomats and official spokespeople sharing this. And so certainly for Chinese state media, finding some way for Twitter to label them similar to what you see on YouTube sometimes, as this station is funded by the Chinese government. Some kind of label like that would be a good idea. I think other ways of trying to label content is maybe being disinformation. I think though that's one of the ways in which you might try to tackle it, but it's really tricky. And I think another part of it is just trying to instill more people with a healthy skepticism, of what these state media and what Chinese officials are saying, particularly in moments of crisis for the CCP.
So Sarah, I'm reminded now of this situation where the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson, he was the one who was basically saying America did it and it's probably the US military, this kind of narrative. And then you had the Chinese ambassador to the US, kind of act in an interview with an American media, distancing himself from that. And then the headline is, the official representative in the U.S. distances himself from this narrative. This caused me to kind of crack a smile, even though this isn't particularly funny, I don't think at all. But I'd love it if you could kind of speak to what you think is going on here.
Well, I think part of what part of what the Chinese government does is they'll pitch different stories to different audiences. So just like you might have a Chinese, a Xinhua news story, and the Chinese version is very different from the English version in ways that are just maybe more aggressive. The tone is more aggressive. The tone is more explicit in one way or another of being heavily politicized. And then the English version kind of tries to paint things in a certain way. I think that's maybe probably what's happening here. I mean, I haven't had a chance to see, but I would expect that it's the case that even after the U.S. the ambassador to the United States distanced himself. I imagine there's at least one Chinese diplomat on Twitter or Chinese state media account that has since then taken some action to reinforce that same narrative that he was distancing himself from. But I don't know that that really matters to them, because I think this is one of the things that's kind of more Russian-esque about what's happening now, which is that in some ways, yes, they're blaming the US, but I think part of what they're trying to get at more generally is to make the point that the origin may not be China. It could be the US, it could be Italy, we don't really know. And then the second is to really just generally muddy the waters about the fact of whether there is an actual truth here. And that's something that Moscow has done, and has done quite effectively on various kinds of incidents, the poisoning of an opposition politician, or in the United Kingdom, other various things that Putin and his security forces have done in different parts of the world. And so where there's very clear evidence linking it back to the Kremlin, but basically the way in which Russia's propaganda works is to try to muddy the waters and create even conflicting conspiracy theories, but they don't care that they're inconsistent, because the point is for you to undermine this conventional wisdom and this sense that there is actually a true reality here, which is that COVID-19 originated in China. China covered it up, and it got out to the rest of the world, and now people are getting very ill and dying. And so I think that's their purpose. So from that perspective, the fact that you might have different Chinese officials or official accounts contradicting themselves isn't necessarily a problem. And so, it gives them space for the ambassador to the US to kind of distance himself from it, even as maybe other parts of the apparatus are trying to spin those very same theories to other audiences, either inside China or in other countries.
So, basically what you're saying here, tell me if I'm right, is that it's just all talking points. Basically, the reality or their official position here isn't all that important at all?
I think it depends on what the topic is. And I think in this case, there's definitely been clear evidence of official backing for this particular narrative. But I think they maybe don't want to 100% own it. And so then they want to give space to the ambassador to kind of, maybe back away or distance himself, especially as they were seeing the kind of backlash it was generating in the United States. I think the other thing is that a lot of this is experimentation. I mean, one of the ways in which some of these tactics are coming out now is that they had already kind of started experimenting with them, especially in 2019, with regards to both what was happening in Xinjiang and pushing back against criticism of the treatment of Uyghur Muslims there, and with regard to the Hong Kong protests. That's actually when a lot of these Chinese diplomats got on Twitter. Before 2019, you had really just a handful, maybe a little bit more. But then all of a sudden you had like 40 Chinese diplomats from different countries get on Twitter during 2019. And so again, I think there's this element of experimentation and kind of what we were talking about before in terms of the propaganda narratives. So I think all of this might be just, it's part of kind of trying to figure out what's going to stick for what audiences and what's going to be effective at achieving the ultimate goal, which is to hold up the Communist Party's legitimacy, to show that they handled this well, and to distract from anything that would really undermine their authority and legitimacy domestically and potentially internationally, because I think they see this also as a moment of weakness for the United States, that it's an opportunity to take advantage of that and maybe weaken the United States more.
Sarah, you mentioned earlier that basically there's some regions in the world, some governments which are much more ready, and even people and populations in general, are much more ready to accept the CCP narratives here. It strikes me that this requires some sort of vigorous response. What would that look like in your mind?
Well, this is part of such a much bigger problem. I think in terms of how the Chinese government influences media in different parts of the world. I mean, I think first of all, the various efforts that are being made to actually expose the manipulation that's behind a lot of this. whether it's calling out that a particular video is fake and not just doing that, but showing the evidence of whatever the manipulation is. The fact that you have not just media in the US, but like media Italian journalists and data scientists going through hashtags in Italian and show on Twitter and showing that these were manipulated trending topics and things like that. I think shedding that type of light is really important because I think even more than trying to go tit for tat on certain, if you get into too much of a he said, she said, that can actually serve feed into what the CCP is trying to do. But I think when you're able to show how they're doing it and how much manipulation is behind it, that helps people understand, like, wow, this is not truthful information, and I should be really skeptical about this source or this narrative or this type of information that I might be hearing. So I think exposing some of the ways they're doing this, and in general, how do you shedding transparency and light on who's behind different entities that are sharing information could be a big part. And then yes, so I think that's a big aspect of it. And then there's all kinds of other things in terms of just media regulation and registrations and how do you try to give how do you protect the space for the free flow of information and more solid, concrete, good reporting, and remove the space for disinformation from different news environments. That I think is a much bigger topic, and in a lot of ways gets outside of my own personal area of expertise.
So Sarah, I sincerely hope that this interview will actually help contribute to this overall effort that you're just described right now. But it also makes me think of, in the China Media Bulletin, you describe essentially media pushback, independent media pushback, or actually some examples of independent journalists. Amazingly enough, they exist even within China to some extent. Pushback, you call it pushback. Tell me about what media are doing or perhaps even should be doing in your view.
So yeah, I think one of the things that's been really amazing to watch in China, especially after so many years of the suppression of the media, has been the courage and the ingenuity of some journalists in China, as well as some of the media outside China who are trying to get information about what's really happening. And so you have this combination of people taking very real risks, whether it's individual citizen journalists that basically made it into either were in Wuhan or went into Wuhan to try to film what was really going on. And that it's partly based on some of the things that they were sharing, that there's quite a bit of skepticism about the actual death toll, the official death toll of what was happening in Wuhan. And then you've got a wide number of other, Chinese media, there's a spectrum. So you've got the Chinese state media, which are very tightly controlled, but you've got these other commercial media outlets. And it used to be that they had stronger investigative reporting teams, but they've kind of, and you periodically see some really serious investigative journalism coming from there, but then they've been, gutted in a lot of ways. But I think in this situation where it's such a terrible human crisis, and it's so clear that there was a cover-up, that there are specific doctors and medical experts in Wuhan who have really important stories to tell, that you've seen some of these media outlets do investigative reports and get this out. As soon as they publish it, it basically gets censored, but it goes viral kind of on social media in China first. And then you have this cat and mouse game of people trying to share it and post it and doing it in really creative ways, because sometimes screenshots will work, but now there's more automated AI-enabled censorship, so that maybe doesn't work. So people translate into Korean, they put it in Pinyin. There was an emoji version of one of the articles. Somebody used some other kind of not really Morse code, but some World War I or World War II code. And then if you knew the code, you could decode it. So some really, I think creative ways for people to share and learn the truth of what's happening. And of course, that also feeds into then, diaspora media like the Epoch Times or NTD or other media outlets like Radio Free Asia, other independent Chinese outlets who are editorial independent, who are trying to shed a light on what's really happening, and that helps inform them. And then they use their own network of contacts. And I think conversations, and you see with some of the Western media, some really good reporters who have been able to either get into Wuhan or talk to people in Wuhan. And I think that's where you really see, some really important evidence of the fact that the death toll is likely higher, of the fact that you have all these asymptomatic cases, of reports of now a riot at the border between Hubei province and a neighboring province because they didn't want to let the people from Hubei leave. So I think it's one of those situations where even in the so deeply constrained environment of the media in China, that information still gets out and even still circulates there. You also see from some of the circumvention tool developers like we work with to disseminate the China Media Bulletin, some upticks in people wanting to jump the firewall because they're trying to get better information about what's happening during a crisis like this. And I think on the question of, like, I was thinking about this yesterday on this question of how do you counter some of the disinformation? Like maybe we can almost like piggyback, take a page out of their book. Because one of the things you see is that you're now seeing, these Chinese Twitter networks and Twitter accounts retweeting Iranian state TV disinformation and Russian RT's account. And I feel like it's maybe something that those of us who are on the other side, without the manipulated element, but just, being even better about retweeting each other's information so that, the counter side of either what's actually really happening, what the evidence is of what's going on in China, these kinds of reports are able to get a wider audience, or also these elements like we were speaking about before of how this disinformation works, being able to have more people do that. So I feel like that's something that maybe, I think whether we're in the human rights community or others can try to see how we can coordinate, to, I think, amplify those types of voices. And you see that happening organically, but maybe there's a way that we could amplify it even further.
To your point, there was this video of the Hong Kong journalist, calling the WHO official and, this very, frankly damning interaction around the issue of Taiwan playing out. And again, we've talked about Taiwan media before. What has the role of Taiwan media been in all of this? Because Taiwan has been kind of this quiet hero in my view, trying to get to the WHO saying, no, there's a big problem here. There's human-to-human transmission. The WHO ostensibly, but for everything we know, just kind of ignoring that, accepting the Chinese Communist Party narrative, which again, given everything we've discussed today, is incredibly disturbing that they would choose to go with the authoritarian dictatorship over the, frankly, democratic country that has quite a bit of transparency. How is Taiwan media playing into all of this right now?
Well, to be honest, I haven't looked that closely at the way Taiwanese media have been reporting on this, but I think in general, what you see with Taiwan and Hong Kong is that in addition to the overall, the main traditional media, which in some cases can be pretty partisan, and in some cases you can see, Beijing's influence actually. What you've seen happen in the last few years is the real rise of various digital news websites, and they generally tend to have business models that allow them to be more independent of the type of co-optation and self-censorship that has affected other traditional media. And so that's actually played a really important role in terms of, and in some cases, those were started by journalists who got really frustrated at working at some of the other outlets and were like, well, this is really important information and I want to publish this, and they went digital. And, again, like we've seen, even some of the pieces I've written have been published, they get thousands and sometimes tens of thousands of views. And I think one of the things that happens in those cases is that when they report something, it actually then creates an internal debate that forces the media that might otherwise not cover it to cover it. Because now it's like really obvious that if you're not covering this, then you must be self-censoring. And so I think we saw that a bit with some of the Hong Kong protests for some of the media that, are maybe more in the middle. in terms of what they were, you had to kind of pick sides a little more clearly. But so I think it's been, that's generally a role, I think, in terms of balancing out and pushing back against this media encroachment from Beijing in these places that's been really effective. I think what's really interesting in Taiwan and Hong Kong is the deep public skepticism. I think in Taiwan you have the skepticism being on the side of the government as well. And I think that's one of the reasons why very early on they were limiting travel from China, even though, to be honest, the Chinese government had already tried to punish Taiwan by limiting Chinese tourists going there. And then they very quickly ramped up mask production and dissemination, both because they lived through SARS, but because maybe it's also just because of the close contacts actually that a lot of people in Taiwan have with people in China, maybe because they knew what was really going on in Wuhan. But basically the Taiwanese government there acted really quickly. In Hong Kong, it was a very different situation where actually the government, because it's much more beholden to Beijing, was really hesitant to act. But the Hong Kong people, especially after all of these months of protests, were like, you have to do something. You have to close the border. We have to all get masks. Basically, one of the things that happened was Hong Kong medical professionals went on strike because to try to push the government to close the border to people coming from China who might have been infected by the virus. And now I think looking back, it really does seem to have been prescient. So I think it's really interesting in terms of, I mean, even if you look at some places in Africa, and it's hard to know the reporting, but like actually pretty early on, they were testing people at the airports in terms of their temperature and things like that. And even though there's a really close connection with China, I think there is sometimes still an underlying skepticism, of products from China and things like that in terms of their quality, and even some of the information that might be coming, that even if they might not publicly admit it, the governments, again, the publics and others were being maybe more careful and more cautious than you might have seen other governments, behaving and taking steps.
So Sarah, to your point, we're seeing more and more evidence, basically, that with a lot of these Western countries and their relatively slow responses, there's been a lot of criticism of that, has been, basically a credulity of sorts to the Chinese Communist Party numbers or the WHO numbers, which came from the Chinese Communist Party directly for all accounts. And, in some cases, and in the case of Italy, this idea that we don't want a stigma of Chinese or something like that. There was even like a hug a Chinese day or something like that was instigated, of course, well-meaning, but given the realities of the information, which I think the Chinese Communist Party had to know at that time, proved to be disastrous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that this really, I think with regard to the World Health Organization especially, I think this has really exposed the degree to which Chinese government influence at these types of global institutions is really so problematic. And it's not just because part of it is that Taiwan tried to warn the WHO that, there was human-to-human transmission and it was disregarded. But I think also just, again, playing into this narrative of praise for the Chinese government, delaying saying that this is the pandemic, some of the questions about access to certain types of, medical specimens and examples and samples and things like that. All of these types of things that I think, fed into this idea of a certain picture of what this virus was that was inaccurate. And so then you have a degree of underpreparedness in other places to deal with it, in addition to some of the governance failures that you have in other countries too, which might be related to their own domestic systems.
So Sarah, aside from sharing viral Twitter, internet videos like this, journalist and WHO official video. I think it was viewed over 7 million times the last I saw. So, obviously a lot of people got to see that and kind of get the message. Aside from, kind of retweeting or sharing something on social media, what can the typical person do to have an impact in all of this?
I think just trying to be well informed yourself, and trying to be skeptical and kind of knowing what are some of these sources of information that are where the Chinese government is using to insert information. I think if you're a subscriber of one of these news media like The Economist or the Wall Street Journal, and you start to see these inserts, send a letter saying, I'm a subscriber. Maybe cancel your subscription, but maybe at the very least say, I'm a subscriber. I'm paying to get your newspaper or your magazine, and you're accepting money that's really very, very, very problematic. So that in of itself, I mean, maybe, whoever's making this decision at these news outlets, if they suddenly got 100, 1,000 letters from subscribers expressing outrage about these types of inserts, maybe that, even more than on the matter of principle would cause them to kind of re-examine that particular policy. So I think those are some of the things that when we look at our own societies and the ways in which we, can influence each other, and our own institutions to be better prepared, and at the very least not to further amplify what the Chinese government is trying to achieve. And I think the other thing is, as we're looking at the way different governments around the world are responding, just because your government may not be doing as good a job as you would like it to do, doesn't necessarily mean that the Chinese government did a good job too. You can have it both ways. It can be that the CCP had a horrific and costly governance failure, where some studies now are saying that maybe 95% of the cases globally could have been prevented if they had actually shared the information they had and not tamped down on it in early January. That doesn't mean that the governments in other parts of the world, aren't making mistakes as well. So I think being able to be comfortable with that you can be critical of both, that you don't have to praise the Chinese government and Communist Party's response as part of your way of voicing criticism, constructive criticism too, about your own government's response. That doesn't necessarily have to be the case. So that would also be something I would encourage people to think about, and even media, in terms of this question of how do we take whether we take the Chinese government's numbers at face value.
Sarah, that's a very powerful place to finish up. Thank you so much for being with us again.
My pleasure.